Right, we're going to focus on two works by Giovanni Bellini, as I've just mentioned. St. Jerome, which is in the Barber, and the portrait of Doge Leonardo Loredan, which is in the National Gallery. And both these images, both these works will be familiar to many people. Let me just slip onto the next slide, perhaps, John. Just to run through what we're quickly going to do. We're going to look at St. Jerome with a close-up of the landscape, and this image is portrayed as a landscape. Then we'll have a portrait of Leonardo Loredan with a close-up of his face, and then a close-up of his ceremonial robe. Then we'll have a very quickly look at a couple of images to show the relationship between Mantegna and Bellini, and then, saving the best till the last, I'll tell you how to make the perfect Bellini cocktail, and we'll discuss Harry's Bar in Venice and a couple of mentions of the cocktail that came out of Harry's Bar. So go to the next slide, please, John. So this is the image in the Barber, and this is was the earliest signed work by Giovanni Bellini. And for somebody so successful, there are remarkably few biographical details about him. For example, we don't really know his date of birth, year of birth. The Barber quotes it as 1430. The National Gallery gives it as 1435, and there's some recent evidence suggesting it was actually between 1424 and 1426. But whatever year he was born, this is his earliest signed work. And this picture is actually dated to about 1450, and there are a couple of references stating that he was about 15 when he painted this, which would put him as being born about 1435. And who was Giovanni Bellini? Well, he was one of the Bellini family. He was born into the sort of artistic royal family, really. His father, Jacopo, was an established painter, as was his brother Gentile, and he had a sister, Nicolosia, who married Andrea Mantegna. There is some evidence accruing that Jacopo wasn't in fact his father, he was his elder brother, but he was brought up in the household of Jacopo. Giovanni is widely recognized as the greatest artist of 15th century Venice, and he's able to embrace a whole range of styles into his work, as we'll see. He started off the first 30 or 40 years using egg yolk, which was the medium at the time, so he painted with tempera. And then when oil paints appeared around 1470s, he was able to master this new medium, and it was actually introduced into Venice by a Sicilian painter, Antonella da Messina. But Giovanni Bellini took the medium of oil onto new levels, and he was able to fuse the colours to create fantastic atmospheric tones, and he's most readily recognised for his calmness and serenity in Venetian painting, and particularly the use of colour and light. And he painted large numbers of religious subjects, devotional panels, and then landscapes and portraits. And it's said that Giovanni Bellini brings the springtime into painting. Albrecht Dürer, whom I have an appointment with tomorrow at the National Gallery, wrote on his second visit to Venice in 1506, when Bellini would have been probably in his late 70s around this time. He says, Dürer wrote, although old, Bellini was still the best painter of all. which wasn't the case during his lifetime. His brother was actually more highly regarded, but nowadays Giovanni Bellini is the artist who is renowned as the outstanding member of the Bellini family. Now, the panel in the Barber is Saint Jerome. And in the Catholic Church, Saint Jerome is recognized as the patron saint of translators, librarians, and encyclopedists. Jerome lived for a time as a hermit, became a priest. He served as the secretary to Pope Damasus, and around the year 389, he established a monastery in Bethlehem. And he's particularly known for his translation of the Bible into Latin, which is known as the Vulgate. In art, as in this panel here, St. Jerome is often depicted with a lion. And the source for this is thought to have been a 2nd century Roman tale of Androcles. Also appears in Aesop's Fables, and George Bernard Shaw wrote Androcles and the Lion in 1912. So this panel is very small and it's very detailed. And if you stand in front of it at the Barber, it's still quite difficult to make out the details. It's only 44 centimeters by 23 centimeters, so 17 by 9 inches. And it's a very popular image. This penitent Saint Jerome was extremely popular in the 14th and 15th century. So the very young Bellini, when he produced this image, presents the saint as a hermit in the Syrian desert. He's dressed only in a white tunic, a thin white tunic, and he's seated on a rock in front of his cave. With his raised right hand, he blesses the lion before him. Now the lion is roaring in pain and raising its left paw to show a large thorn sticking out. And Bellini shows Saint Jerome as both a hermit and a scholar. The hermit is suggested by his darkened skin from long hours exposed to the sun, and also by the rather skeletal, sort of semi-emaciated figure. The scholar is shown with the sacred scripture in his left hand. The lion is said to have panicked the monks in the monastery at Bethlehem, but he recognized it as a divine messenger. The left foreground, as we look at the image on the left-hand side, the foreground is dominated by this huge rocky outcrop which comes across diagonally. And then on the right-hand side, you've got this horizontal line in the middle, dividing the landscape into two. So you've got this arid desert on the bottom half, contrasted with the rather lush, verdant landscape above it, which is more typical of the Veneto region. And this sort of Veneto landscape is appearing in many of Bellini's subsequent works. The symbolism of this was described when the painting went to the John Paul Getty Museum in 2017. And there's a very scholarly description of it, the best description I've read anywhere. And they talk about the introduction of Northern European art by Bellini. The Northern Europeans, the Northern Renaissance, were the first to introduce or make landscape painting as a sort of specific genre. So Albrecht Altdorfer in particular used to produce landscapes, often imaginary, so they weren't real places. But he had landscapes without any figures. So it was just a landscape. There was no narrative, there was no story, but he was focusing on the detail of and the beauty of the landscape itself. Bellini has picked this up, and he shows in the background here on the right hand side as we look at it, the landscape with another feature of Northern European art, which is disguised symbolism. So, according to the Getty analysis, the dying tree, if we look at the far right hand side as we look at it, you can see the stunted dying tree, and this is supposed to represent the saint's solitary meditation. His writings, which he's holding in his left hand, sacred scripture, could revive the withered plant of the scriptures. Looking at the desert landscape in the back, it's very hard to make out. Maybe if we go to the next slide, perhaps, John. That creature in the middle of the landscape in the desert is apparently a donkey. Even if you stand in front of the panel, I find it very hard to make it out. It looks more like a horse to me, but it's reputedly a donkey. And the donkey, in the Getty analysis, symbolizes a life of solitude, penitence, and poverty, which is a surprise to me, but that's what it says it is. And if we go back to the first image again, please, John. If we see, I'm not sure if you can make it out, at the bottom right of the image, or the left hand side as we look at it, which I missed on my first few visits to the barber. I was so busy looking at St. Jerome and the lion, I didn't realize there was a small animal on the bottom left corner, which is a rabbit. And this rabbit is considered, again by, thanks John, by the Getty, to be a metaphor for the hermit's life in the cave. Now, Bellini drew on two sources for this image of the powerful rock formation, which sort of comes across diagonally, and then the landscape on the right hand side, which is rather luminous, which is one of the aspects Giovanni Bellini was to go on and make one of his strengths. The first influence was Jacopo, his father or his older brother, whichever he is. There was a recent reflective graphic analysis showing the figure of the saint has very thick outlines, thick contour, and then the musculature in the arms is built up with very short, precise hatch marks, which is the style of Jacopo Bellini, which was picked up by Giovanni. The lion is represented in one of Jacopo Bellini's sketchbooks. Jacopo left two sketchbooks. One is in the British Museum and the other one is in the Louvre. And there's a page in the Louvre sketchbook which is just lots of drawings of lions, and one of them is exactly this image. So Giovanni has taken this image of a lion drawn by his father and incorporated it into St. Jerome in the desert. I emailed the Louvre to see if they could provide any further information. They were reasonably helpful, but they referred me to their database, which is, it's like wandering into the Louvre. It's just enormous, it's huge. It takes you ages to navigate around. But if you eventually do find the page, you will see a page of lion drawings with this particular image shown there. Another influence from Jacopo is that Jacopo Bellini was very fond of the classical Roman art. He owned a number of classical sculptures and medals. And Giovanni adopted this classicizing enthusiasm by using Roman imperial capitals for his signature. I don't know whether you can enlarge that again, John, to show the signature at the bottom here, which is on the cartellino. And the odd thing about this, is signing his name in Roman capitals, is that he's used an unusual spelling. We can compare this with a different spelling he's used on the next image of the portrait of Doge Leonardo Loredan. More typically, Johannes would have two N's. He's only got one here. And Bellini would have two L's, and there's only one L. And one of the paintings which Jacopo left has the same spelling. So whatever the reason, there's a different spelling here in the early work by Giovanni Bellini. So there's a strong influence with the lion, with the Roman numerals, and with the outline of the St. Jerome from Jacopo. The second influence was from his brother-in-law, Mantegna. Mantegna has adopted a very similar composition for his version of St. Jerome, and there's a fresco in the Obitari Chapel in Padua, again showing a similar composition with the saint and the lion. So what's the story with the lion? Most people will be familiar with the story, which dates back to the 2nd century of Androcles in the Roman story called Attic Nights. Now, Androcles was a runaway slave of a Roman consul in Africa, and he took shelter in a cave which turned out to be the den of a wounded lion. And he removed the large thorn from the paw of the lion, and then they remained together in the cave for about 3 years. And the lion would go hunting for food and kept Androcles with a supply. After the 3 years, Androcles felt he wanted to return to civilization, but when he tried, he was imprisoned as a fugitive slave, and he was sent to Rome, where he was condemned to death, to be devoured by wild animals in the Circus Maximus before the Emperor Caligula. So, a bit like Christians thrown to the lions, Androcles is thrown out in front of the emperor and the cheering crowd. The wild animal comes charging out towards him, and would you believe it, it turns out to be the very same lion that Androcles has befriended in the cave. So instead of tearing him to shreds, comes over and Androcles pats him on the head, and they walk off together. So Caligula is really impressed. He pardons the slave, and thereafter they apparently, according to a writer called Appian, became celebrities and used to wander around the streets of Rome, Androcles with the lion on a lead. It's often occurred to me, if Caligula had said, well, that was a fluke, let's see you do it with another lion, we wouldn't have had quite the same story. Can we move on to the next slide, please, John? The portrait of the Doge. This, to me, is a stunning portrait. I don't think you can walk past this in the National Gallery without being astonished by it. It's fabulously colourful. One of Giovanni Bellini's trademarks. It's an oil work. It's dated from 1501, so it's a lot later than the Barber work. And by this time, Giovanni Bellini has mastered the use of oil. And this is oil on poplar. It's 61.5 times 44.5 centimeters, so about 2 feet by 1.5 feet, much larger than the very small panel in the Barber. And the Doge is the Venetian Republic head of state. He's elected for life, and he's shown here in a very formal official costume with his ceremonial robes. He was apparently a very prickly, temperamental character, quite ruthless when he needed to be. And Bellini has portrayed him with a very stern, intense expression. And in contrast to previous portraits, which adopted the sort of the Roman medallion type of profile format, Bellini has picked up again, going back to the Northern European style, he's picked up the Northern European practice of the three-quarter view, which was exemplified by Jan van Eyck and lots of other Northern Renaissance artists, as well as the chap who introduced oil to Bellini, Antonello da Messina. So he's showing the Doge in the three-quarter view here, and this allows him to show a rather more three-dimensional view of his face. You've got he's giving a nod to Jacopo's classical interest with the sort of the Roman bust format, and it's almost a sculptural appearance of the way the Doge looks as if he's been squeezed into that ceremonial robe. It's very tight fitting around his neck, and that rather tight fitting sculptural appearance is sort of rather like Donatello in Padua, and the balustrade or balcony in the foreground is very, again, classical Roman, very Titian-like. Titian being one of Bellini's pupils. So he's got his name. I don't know whether you can show the name this time, John. You can see. Thanks, John. That's great. Whether you can make it out or not, the spelling is different here, and this is the more conventional spelling. So there's no H, there's IOANN, unlike in the Barber. And the Bellini is BELL, again, unlike the spelling in the Barber. So, but the Roman numerals are the same. And the cartellino, this sort of paper-like inscription, is Bellini showing his versatility, showing that he can portray the image of paper in the same image as very lifelike facial features and the fabric, which is beautifully portrayed. We go back to the image, John, thanks. As with many of Van Eyck's images, the face is illuminated from the left, and it's a rather three-dimensional. The background is very plain. It's a very striking deep blue ultramarine, and it's darker at the top. It gets a little bit lighter as it comes down the image. And the Doge is shown wearing his very expensive white and gold damask silk robe, which contrasts with the deep blue background. He's got his horned ducal cap, which is the corno ducale, and he wears this very expensive damask fabric, which is shown. Perhaps I think we need to jump on to 2 slides actually, John. Next slide is a close-up of the face. That's fine. This is a close-up of the fabric, and Bellini has used rather thin layers of paint for the facial tones and much thicker layers here to denote the silk, which is woven with gold and silver metal thread. The buttons on the left-hand side, as we look at it, the buttons are called campanoni d'ori, large bells of gold, and they're typically made of gold thread wound around a wooden core. And if you look at the fabric, this is a pomegranate design, which came from Eastern Mediterranean textiles and was very popular and used in Renaissance fabrics. And if you look at it closely, you can see that this pomegranate design is actually upside down. And Bellini has portrayed this accurately because when it was worn, the sort of the cloak or the mantle would be more usually seen from behind, when it would be the right way up. So for ceremonial processions, people would be looking at the Doge from behind and they would see the pomegranate design as it was meant to be. And this attention to detail, showing the pomegranate design in reality from the front upside down, suggests that Bellini borrowed the mantle so that he got it extremely accurately. Perhaps go back to the previous image, John, the close-up of the face. I made reference to the Doge being a rather irritable character. Does Bellini capture that personality? Well, I think he does. He looks firm, he looks rather severe, and the reflections of light in his eyes suggest that he's looking towards the sun, which is rather low in the sky. So this is thought to be a meditation on aging. So as the sun is setting, the aging Doge, although he's not that old, is represented by the reflections from the setting sun. If you look at the expression on his face, it's asymmetrical. Now, you don't have to do this now, but it's quite interesting. If you cover up half of his face with your hand and look at the right-hand side, the well-lit side, it looks rather severe on that side. If you cover up the well-lit side and look at the shadowed side of his face, which you can see more clearly, there are more creases. You can see a bit of stubble on his chin. You can see the wrinkles be next to his eye. You can see the deeper creases on his cheeks, and it's rather more benevolent. So some writing suggests that Bellini was trying to be even-handed and represent the two sides of his personality. Yes, he was a prickly, irritable character, but he was also fair in his judgments. So there's an irritable side and a more benevolent side. Interestingly, I read another review of this which had it the other way around, which felt that the more benevolent side was on the well-lit side. So you can do that for yourselves. Cover up the two sides and see which you think is the more grumpy of the two. But I think there is a definite difference in the two images. Perhaps move on to the next slide, please, John. And the next. Now this is, oh, sorry, John. Just slip back quickly to the portrait. Bellini wanted to focus on the power of the Doge rather than emphasize his personality too much. And he's done this in three separate ways. He shows meticulous attention to detail of the ceremonial outfit. So he's showing this is an important man, which he was. He was the head of the Republic. So he's showing him in his ceremonial robes, very splendid robes, and he's showing him in a very formal manner. And he's depicted the texture of the fabrics in a manner which he's picked up from Northern Europeans again. Flemish portraits paid meticulous attention to detail, particularly in their rendition of fabric. And that's what Giovanni Bellini is showing here. So he's showing this is an important man, very ceremonially dressed, to focus on his power. Secondly, he gives the Doge a very classical, assured pose, rather like a Roman emperor, rather like Titian would show somebody. He's turned towards the light. We can see the wrinkles, but this is clearly a man of substance, a man of standing. So it's a formal bust portrait which echoes back to classical art. Thirdly, Bellini emphasizes the figure by giving us a very plain background. There's no landscape here. He's got a very striking ultramarine blue, but it contrasts very nicely with the white and gold of the fabric, and it means that your eye is drawn to the figure. So in three ways, Bellini emphasizes that here is a man of considerable importance. Sorry, John. Now we can go on to the two images at the end. So I mentioned before that Mantegna and Giovanni Bellini were brothers-in-law, and they did collaborate a bit. There was a fabulous exhibition at the National Gallery 3 years ago comparing Bellini and Mantegna. Some of you may have been, but I went. It was a wonderful exhibition. And one example of the similarities between Bellini and Mantegna is provided by the two images provided here. There were other examples shown in this exhibition in which it's quite difficult to tell whether an image was by Mantegna or Bellini because their styles are very similar. I was going to use this as a quick quiz, but it's difficult to do that in the format of a Zoom or a Teams presentation. And there's also a temptation to cheat. John tells me he didn't cheat, but he guessed correctly. So there's two images which are extremely similar, one by Mantegna and one by Bellini. And this one, the first one, if you haven't already looked it up or don't know or haven't guessed, is Bellini. And Bellini has got more figures in his image. You've got the Virgin and Child in the middle. You've got the priest, Simeon, taking the Christ child. And looking on in the background is either St. Joseph or, more likely, Jacopo, Giovanni's father. On the right-hand side, as we look at it, the two male figures, one looking directly out at us is the self-portrait, This is Giovanni Bellini, and unusually, he's looking directly at us. The figure next to him is either his brother Gentile or his brother-in-law Mantegna, and from the other images, it seems more likely that this is Mantegna. Over on the left-hand side, as we look at it, the two female figures are his mother Anna at the far side, and then his sister Nicolosia, who is also the wife of Andrea Mantegna. And the next slide, John, is the version by Mantegna. Just two figures in the background, at the edges rather. You've got the self-portrait again on the right side as we look at it, which is Andrea Mantegna. And on the left-hand side, we have his wife, Nicolosia. In the background, looking out at the priest, is a very grumpy-looking Jacopo Bellini, but not quite as grumpy as the priest, who looks as if he's furious about something. He's really angry. So this is Mantegna, and this was painted in 1455. The version by Bellini was painted in 1460. So Bellini has used the same composition, added a couple more figures, but you can see if you flick back and forth between them that they're very, very similar. And there are a number of other works. I mean, the National Gallery has got their respective versions of the Agony in the Garden, which are quite different, but you can still see a number of similarities, especially in the use of colour, where Giovanni Bellini is so strong. There's been, I mean, this exhibition, if people went to it at the National Gallery, suggestions that they fed off each other, that they wouldn't have been the same artists without each other. But the collaboration wasn't that close. They were established artists before they met. And Mantegna spent most of his career in Padua, and Giovanni Bellini rarely moved out of Venice. So they would have been great artists in their own right, whether they had met or not. But it's interesting to see that there were many similarities, especially early on in their careers. There wasn't a rivalry. They did work harmoniously together. Last slide, please, John. So how to make the perfect Bellini. Before we discuss that, we should mention this interesting story about Harry's Bar in Venice. In 1929, there was a young American called Harry Pickering, who came from a wealthy Boston family. And he arrived in Venice with too much money and nothing to do. And he spent 2 months in the Hotel Europa, most of which he seems to have spent in the bar, where he befriended the barman Giuseppe Cipriani. And because he spent most of his time in the bar, his Boston family cut off his allowance, so he was stranded in Venice, couldn't get home. So Giuseppe lent him 10,000 lira so he could get back home to the States, probably thinking that was the last he was going to see of his money. But 2 years later, Harry returns, and Giuseppe is still working behind the bar in the Hotel Europa. And Harry walks up and says, "Mr. Cipriani, thank you. Here's the 10,000 lira that you kindly lent to me. And to show my appreciation, here's another 40,000 lira, which is enough to open a bar. We'll call it Harry's Bar." So, on May the 13th, 1931, Giuseppe Cipriani opened Harry's Bar on the San Marco waterfront. If you've been, or if you know where it is, it's actually not very easy to find. You have to go looking for it or know where it is. It's not easy to find at all. And Harry's Bar became very popular, and it was frequented by people like Ernest Hemingway, Orson Welles, Charlie Chaplin, lots of celebrities. In 1948, Giuseppe Cipriani, he was fond of making cocktails, and he was mixing cocktails up, and he tried Prosecco with white peach puree. White peaches are very common and popular in the Veneto region in the summer. So he was making a puree of white peach, put in some Prosecco, and then he added a bit of raspberry puree, which gave it a sort of pink appearance. And it reminded him of the colour of the toga of a saint in one of Giovanni Bellini's paintings. We don't know which painting he was particularly referring to. So, because of the colour, he called it, this cocktail, a Bellini. Could have called it Cipriani, but he chose Bellini. And this became extremely popular in Harry's Bar in Venice. Subsequently, through Hemingway and others, it became very popular in New York in the States, and it's now a very popular cocktail worldwide. But Giuseppe wasn't finished. In 1950, he was in the bar one day, and one of his regular customers, the Contessa Amalia Nani Mocenigo, came in, and she was in tears. So Giuseppe said, "Sit down." He said, "What's the problem?" And she said her doctor had just told her she had to go on a strict diet, avoiding cooked meat, which was a problem for the Italian Contessa. She says, "What am I going to eat?" So Giuseppe offered her a Bellini. Remember, he just invented it 2 years before. And he said, "Give me 15 minutes. So he disappeared into the small kitchen. If you've been to Harry's Bar, you'll know it's actually a very small place. There's a very small kitchen at the back. So Giuseppe disappeared. 15 minutes later, he reappears from the kitchen with a dish of thin sheets of red raw beef covered with a white sauce of mayonnaise and mustard. And the Contessa said, "What's this?" And Giuseppe, thinking very quickly, he said, "This is beef carpaccio," because it reminded him of the red and white colours the artist Vittore Carpaccio used when he was painting the Doge to the red and white robe. So we've got the Bellini cocktail invented by Giuseppe Cipriani in 1948. And we've got carpaccio, and there's many different types of carpaccio now, but the original one was beef carpaccio, invented by Giuseppe when the Contessa Nani Mocenigo was distressed and appeared in the bar. How do I know all this? Am I making it all up? Well, it's actually in the definitive account of Harry's Bar, written by Giuseppe's son, Arrigo Cipriani, and Arrigo is the Italian for Harry. So Arrigo, who is now 89 years old, has written this very detailed account, and many stories of which came to him from his father, Giuseppe, and the stories of the origin of Bellini cocktails and Carpaccio come from Giuseppe via his son Arrigo. So this is the cocktail recipe for the original Bellini. It's 2 parts Prosecco, not champagne. It doesn't work with champagne apparently, so it must be Prosecco. And the original recipe was for white peach puree. If you haven't got white peaches, then the other peaches will work as well. And you need a few drops of raspberry juice, which is what Giuseppe Cipriani used, but cherry juice will work as well to give it the pink color. So that's how you make a Bellini cocktail. That's probably a good point at which to open up the discussion.